Welcome to episode 51 of the G2 on 5G. It's our first episode of our second season, and we're excited to have a guest with us today as well. But it's the latest inside scoop on everything 5G. We cover 6 topics in about 15 minutes, and it's brought to you by More Insights and Strategy. Joining me again this week is fellow analyst Anshel Sag, and we welcome Diana Guverts from Fierce Wireless joining us, and we plan to have Diana on the podcast at least once a month moving forward. So Diana, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you guys for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
Awesome. Well, let's get into my first topic this week. And Cradlepoint and Celona announced a partnership to deliver 5G services. So what's the big deal about this? If you don't know Cradlepoint, they power a lot of solutions that you probably interact with every day. They're behind the red box video kiosks. They're also deployed in Starbucks and in a number of different locations. And they've been delivering an LTE and now a 5G router that enables connectivity in challenging areas and locations. And so I've talked about Solona on prior podcasts. They're a startup providing private 5G as a service. And so the potential from my perspective is that Cradlepoint will be able to leverage some of Celona's intellectual property, in particular their micro slicing feature, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's a network slicing feature that allows you to be able to fine tune an application's performance based on requirements for latency or throughput or that sort of thing. So I see this partnership as sort of supercharging, Celona's capabilities. It brings Cradlepoint some additional capability as well. And as you may recall, Cradlepoint was recently acquired by Ericsson. So, they have a very successful infrastructure provider behind them. And so I think this is goodness on both sides of the fence there. So with that, Diane, I'm going to toss it over to you. And your first topic this week is you want to talk about Verizon C-Band and their mmWave carrier aggregation trialing.
Yeah, so this is another thing that Verizon has going on. They've been doing a lot of trials in the C-Band. I wrote a story about how they were doing trials in a bunch of different places, trying to pinpoint where they might launch first. But this week is a mmWave carrier aggregation trial. So they were able to hit 4.3 gigabits per second, and that was using a 100 megahertz channel of C-Band and a 600 megahertz channel of mmWave. And for me, the big deal about this is that it used 5G carrier aggregation. So carrier aggregation is not a new technology, right? We have it in 4G. That's not the big deal. But for 5G, this is going to allow operators to use a higher band downlink, so faster speeds with a lower band uplink, which will help with range. And the other thing I wanted to point out is this is something we saw when T-Mobile did a carrier aggregation trial with 600 megahertz and 2.5 gigahertz back in October. So this to me kind of signals a ramping up of a technology that's going to be really key in the 5G world. So I don't know if maybe, Anshel, you had something to add there.
Yeah, I think it's definitely something that is going to be necessary for a lot of operators to build out mmWave, especially considering it's still a line of sight technology. I do think it'll be interesting to see how Verizon's carrier aggregation using mid-band with mmWave will work, just because we don't really know what their mid-band coverage will be like, and we don't even know what it'll look like in 4 years. So I think it'll be interesting just because they have a very different coverage story than, say, T-Mobile with their 600 megahertz band. But otherwise, it's still a positive thing regardless.
Yeah, I would agree with that. We've talked about, their $45 billion purchase of spectrum assets, and they're going to have to find creative ways to get the right level of performance out of that investment. Anshel, you made a good point. mmWave does require densification, given the shorter propagation distance. So, a very smart move on their part for sure.
I think that carries us back to Anshel for the next piece of news, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So this one is related to Starlink, and basically what it says is that Starlink, first of all, has 500,000 users that are potential customers that have put orders in for a Starlink kit which includes their motorized dish that can receive signal, but also they were reporting that Ookla had gone in and basically taken data samples from users that were connected to Starlink and assessing the speeds of people's connections relative to broadband that was available locally. So that in some places it was up to, 500 times faster than the local connection. In other places it was 70% slower. So this is going to be a story that you're probably going to see happen constantly, but ultimately the interesting data is that the median download speeds from Starlink ranged from 40 megabits to 90 megabits, which is pretty good for a satellite technology. And Starlink does tell their beta users who are currently who's using the network today, they can expect speeds from 50 to 150 megabits with latency from 20 to 40 milliseconds. So they seem to be hitting what they're promising so far. And it'll really come down to how does this scale and whether or not they're going to be able to scale 500,000 users or even millions of users, which I think is ultimately what they're going to have to do. I think the real question is going to come down to what kind of infrastructure they have to have in place to supply, that 1,000 satellites that they plan on launching, to be able to deliver this service on a global scale. I don't know. What do you have? Do you have any thoughts, Will?
Yeah, I do. So, well, one note, that those 500,000 orders came in on May the 4th. So Star Wars Day was interesting. But, we've talked about Starlink on prior podcasts, and, even at those speed levels and the inconsistency, these are game changers for people in rural America. And, I think I mentioned this on a prior podcast as well. I spent time with Tractor Supply Company. They have a footprint of over 2,000 locations, and they are located in rural parts of the United States. They're trialing something, I believe, in Montana, and they're seeing 10 times the performance improvement with the Starlink system. So yeah, it will take time. I think there are concerns about the contention of the number of satellites that are potentially going to be in orbit, because this is a low Earth orbit deployment to get the right latency and performance that you need. And we've also talked about OneWeb and others that are providing similar services. So it's almost like there's a space race with respect to LEO. But it'll be interesting to see how things turn out longer term. Diana, anything to add?
Yeah, actually, Anshel, to your point about scaling, I think Elon Musk tweeted something about how they're going to be able to serve these, 500,000 customers just fine. The problem is going to come when they get to millions and millions. And the other point I wanted to make is I'm pretty sure Starlink just got a whole boatload of money from the government in one of these funding auctions that they just did. I think it was RDOF, right? Was that the one?
Elon does a good job of getting the government dollars. I mean, he's done that with Tesla and SpaceX, right?
$900 million from RDOF. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So I mean, yeah. Well, and that's the thing. That's why reports like the one that came out from Ookla are important, because it's kind of showing what we're throwing money at as a country. And I think that's really interesting to keep an eye on going forward, especially given how many satellite players are kind of jostling for room. It'll be interesting to see how that shakes out.
I agree. Well, let's move to my second and final topic this week. I want to talk about T-Mobile, and they crushed their Q1 earnings. I mean, it was unbelievable. And I've got some stats right here. Their earnings were 92 cents a share, beating most estimates of about 50 to 55 cents. When you look at their revenue improvement, quarter, year over year, I mean, they've gone from about 11 billion to almost 20 billion, ending March of this year. And so they continue to hit on all cylinders. We've talked about that they have the most complete spectrum footprint with the Sprint assets, and so they're just killing it in consumer. And so it kind of begs the question: Is there additional upside? And certainly Neville and the team believe that, just given the forecast that they provided, financial and technology analysts like ourselves. But I think there is definitely tremendous upside, and that upside is really going to come in the form of they're building out their enterprise services portfolio. We've talked about what they've done to kind of start that, but I think there's a tremendous opportunity ahead of them, especially with IoT. And when you look at the investment that Sprint made prior to the merger with their Curiosity IoT network. So, the future's looking very bright for them. They're killing it on all fronts from a consumer perspective. They're certainly out in front of their competitors with 5G when you look at standalone as one example. And I see tremendous upside with respect to the enterprise services. So Diana, anything to add there?
Yeah. So I believe it was our editor-in-chief, Linda Hardesty, just wrote a story about this. But the two things I'm watching in terms of T-Mobile are its moves in the enterprise space and also its moves on edge computing. I think you guys talked about this on one of your recent podcasts, the deal that they did with Lumen. I think on the earnings call, I believe Mike Sievert kind of mentioned that they're going to have more news around that coming later this year in terms of working with customers to deploy new services. So it'll be interesting to see how they turn that partnership with Lumen into a revenue generating opportunity. And again, back to what they're doing in the enterprise, not just enterprise connections in terms of serving them with mobile services or work from home suites, but also what potential moves they might make around private networks. So that is definitely something we'll be watching. And a shameless plug here for Fierce's upcoming Private Wireless Networking Summit. It's coming next week. We're going to be doing a lot of great stuff, so tune in.
Yeah, no, awesome stuff. I think private networking is going to be a big deal, just like the internet. But Diana, you want to talk, your second and final topic this week, you want to talk about US Cellular, right? And they're an operator that provides a lot of support for rural America, right?
Yeah, if I remember correctly, now they would be the fourth. They used to be the fifth largest operator. Now they're the fourth. And they have some more news on mmWave. To our points earlier about mmWave not really propagating so well, they did an extended range test with, I think it was Ericsson, Inseego, and Qualcomm. It was a fixed wireless trial, and they reached 7 kilometers, which is about 4.3 miles. And they achieved sustained average downlink speeds of about a gigabit per second, and sustained average uplink speeds of about 55 megabits per second. And so I just want to point out that this kind of builds on a trial that they did in September 2020, again with, I think, Ericsson and Qualcomm. Again, it was an extended range trial, and that earlier trial used 28 gigahertz. And during that one, they reached 5 kilometers, so 3.1 miles. So they're kind of stretching it out further and further, and notably getting faster speeds, because in the earlier one, they were only around 100 megabits per second. So it's quite a big difference. And it's also noteworthy that US Cellular has 24, 28, 39 gigahertz. And in talking with them and some of their executives last year, they had mentioned that they were kind of looking around fixed wireless opportunities, as well as using mmWave in denser areas within their footprint. So this is kind of exciting because obviously, though it's US Cellular's trial, they are not the only one in the US who's pursuing mmWave. And I'm wondering what you guys think about whether this has implications for Verizon, for even AT&T. Anshel, do you have anything there?
Yeah, I have lots of thoughts around mmWave. It's interesting because there's a lot of people out there that are very negative about mmWave, but I think it's because a lot of them were misled about what mmWave is capable of, and understanding its characteristics. And I don't think mmWave is ever going to be a technology that's available everywhere, but I do think it will have very useful purposes in stadiums, concert venues, but also as a fixed wireless solution to deliver that last mile. This is the biggest problem that so many operators have today, which is delivering that last mile of service, digging that last mile of fiber, that last mile of copper, whatever it might be. That's the most costly amount of digging that they have to do. And I think that if they can really build these out in places that are needed the most, I could totally see this being a technology that improves rural broadband, as well as I think being a really powerful technology for small businesses, where we could see suburban and urban small businesses getting access to internet where they simply couldn't get it before because they didn't want to tear up the streets. So I do think long-term millimeter wave is going to be very powerful. And I think these kinds of speeds prove that it can scale to a point where it is a viable technology. And that range, which is impressive on its own, also shows that millimeter wave in 5G can operate much like millimeter wave does today for proprietary backhaul technologies, because there's a lot of companies that already use millimeter wave as a backhaul. And I think that's going to be how we use it for 5G, but obviously as an anchor for other bands and as a way to just deliver internet to people who have been struggling with DSL for the last decade.
Yeah, I've got one comment there. I think fixed wireless access is a total slam dunk for US Cellular. And I've talked about it on prior podcasts about how I believe it's going to be a critical element in getting the digital divide, bridged and built out. And so from my perspective, it's an absolute slam dunk for them.
Can I just add one more thing to your points about rural and closing the digital divide? I was actually speaking with CCA CEO Steve Berry recently, and he wasn't speaking about millimeter wave specifically, so I don't want to put those words in his mouth. But he was talking about the importance of using broadband funding to include both fixed and wireless technologies like fixed wireless access. And his point was that, yeah, you can run fiber to a farmer's house, but that doesn't cover his barn. It doesn't cover his fields for those IoT use cases, for those precision agriculture. So seeing US Cellular do this makes me wonder whether that might be a real game changer for the rural markets. And I just want to shout out to my colleagues, Bevan Fletcher and Monica, for bringing both the US Cellular story and the Verizon story to my attention this week. They are rad. And now I think we have one more piece of news, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Anshel, take us home.
The last one.
Yeah.
So the last one is basically that India is doing its first 5G trials, preparing for the launch of its 5G networks later this year. And what's interesting is the big four operators, which are Bharti Airtel, MTN, Reliance Jio, and Vodafone, are conducting these 5G trials, but they're not conducting them with any equipment from Huawei or ZTE, which is interesting because the government actually said that it was okay. So the government actually gave these operators clearance to use Chinese infrastructure vendors, but they chose not to. And as a result, they're using Ericsson, Nokia, Samsung, and CDOT instead of using Huawei or Ericsson. And what's interesting is these trials will ultimately determine what equipment can be used in the commercial networks, because from what I understand, these are not commercial deployments, so they're not allowed to connect these to their commercial networks. And as a result, these are being tested to verify their compatibility and that they fit within the government's expectations of radiation and all those kinds of things. So it'll be interesting because if ZTE and Huawei aren't validated in these trials, I don't think they're going to be able to use them. So this might be a political posturing where the government approves it for use, but quietly the operators are told not to use it in their trials, which then allows the government to wash its hands of any responsibility that they banned Huawei or ZTE. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this plays out, but it seems like this is another loss for Huawei and ZTE on the infrastructure side. I don't know if you have any comments, Will.
I do. So, I see this as being sort of politically motivated. I mean, it's no secret India right now is struggling with COVID-19. and the U.S. is doing all that it can to get them equipment, to manufacture vaccines, to get them vaccines and that sort of thing. So, I'm wondering if, behind the scenes, this isn't some sort of, political realignment. But I wanted to ask you, Anshel, as you double clicked into this, what about, the use of Open RAN? Because, like Reliance as an operator, right? They were very highly virtualized with respect to rolling out their LTE network, right? They did it, in record time. Is Open RAN even a consideration? Because the added, there is complexity with it, but the benefit is a sort of a more North American aligned supply chain with hardware and software vendors. So I'm wondering if you have any color or perspective on what they're kind of considering around Open RAN.
So I didn't see any mention of Open RAN. However, Reliance Jio will be using its own equipment, which I believe will be highly customized Open RAN.
Right.
And that's where I think that's where you're going to see Open RAN deployed, is in their custom built network with what they claim to be their own hardware. So we'll see how that works out. I don't know if Diana, you had any insights before I wrap it up.
Not really. It's just really interesting to me to see kind of what happens when the Indian market kind of shuts out certain players. From a handset perspective, I guess Apple was really pursuing India, and they kind of bent over backwards to try to make sure they could get their foot in the door. So it'll be interesting from my perspective to see what this does to Huawei or ZTE to lose out on what is going to be a huge market. So that's all I have to add.
Yeah, I mean, they were definitely the fastest growing market for a long time, and they're easily one of the largest markets for 4G, and they will be one of the largest for 5G. So I totally understand that, and it'll be interesting to see how that plays out long term. But I think that kind of wraps things up for us this week. So we hope our viewers and listeners found this week's topics interesting. If anyone out there would like to reach out to us to provide a specific insight on a specific 5G topic for our future podcast, please reach out to us on social media. Diana's at Dia Marie's Beat, Will is at Willtown Tech, and I'm at Anshel Sag. We hope you have a great weekend, and please tune in again next week.